delighted to be with you this morning, looking at the future of geography, teaching climate change, sustainability, and focusing on green skills as well. So I think the first thing that it's quite useful to do is to actually think about, in order to teach the future, I think we need to look at the past and what's kind of going on now. So I'm going to start off by doing a very, very sort of potted, brief, and very selective history of geography. This is not supposed to be comprehensive. It's not supposed to be, complete. But it does give us a bit of a flavour of where geographical knowledge has come from and where it's going to. So actually, if you sort of put geography as a search term into a search engine, the geography dates back millennia, almost as far as people have been on the planet. It's geography means writing the earth. But I'm going to start our story actually with the Romans. The Romans using geographical knowledge, using maps to kind of further their own purpose, really. Planning roads, towns, their military campaigns. So geographical knowledge there and maps was used for a very specific purpose. Then we move on to the European Age of Discovery, using geographical knowledge, maps, particularly for navigating into the unknown, to find those sort of alternative trade routes and for colonial expansion. And then actually going through to the age of imperialism, that sort of geography was actually had quite a high status. It was sort of dubbed the science of imperialism par excellence, and used to support colonial projects and exploration. Now, we talking about sort of the issues around that sort of history of geographical knowledge. I think that's a separate webinar and a very interesting one potentially. But you can see here that geographical knowledge was used by people. It was seen as an important way of developing society and for using for people's own sort of ends. It's worth saying that actually it was at this point that geography actually became an academic discipline. It was only really, professorships were only really established in the late sort of 1880s, when it was first taught in universities as a sort of formal academic discipline. But actually the first degree awarded in geography itself was as late as 1919. So in academic terms, geography is quite a young subject. The 1950s to about 1990s saw a sort of diversification in geographical knowledge, saw the sort of development of subfields. And actually this is when I was at university. And so quite a lot of the geographical knowledge that I had and that I was inducted into was in these kind of subfields of geography, looking at behavioural geography, medical geography, systematic geography. I did quite a lot of work when I was at university on sort of disease spread and things like that, which obviously is incredibly relevant. And it's at that point there was that sort of emergence of quantitative geography, spatial science, and geographical information systems, so GIS. More recently, actually, geography has a sort of slightly different flavour. It's moved from that kind of multidisciplinary to becoming interdisciplinary. So those linkages between different subjects. So rather than geography being sort of jack of all trades, it's become like that hub and spoke model. It's at the hub linking different subjects together. And I think for the purposes of this talk, actually there's that growing emphasis on environmental issues and sustainable development. So you can really see the history of geographical knowledge changing and adapting over time. And that sort of begs the question, where are we today? What might geography look like, in the near future? And for my money, I think actually that it's taking on those themes of global challenge, such as climate change and sustainability. It's using advanced data, spatial analysis to be able to do that. And it's also integrating those diverse perspectives, so Indigenous knowledges as well as feminist geography. So I think that's kind of where we are in terms of geographical knowledge. It's quite interesting to see how that geographical knowledge has changed to address the concerns of the day. And obviously, the concerns of today are around those global challenges, that sort of climate change and sustainability. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that actually, whereas, you know, a couple of 100 years ago, the perspective was very much on sort of empire and colonialism. Actually, what geography is doing now is recognizing those more diverse perspectives and giving that a sort of lens to look at issues such as climate change. So why should we teach about climate change? I suppose that's a valid and a good sort of starting question, I suppose. As I've said, you know, geographical knowledge has adapted to the concerns of the day, and climate change is one of the most pressing concerns of today. I think actually that might be understating it. There's quite a lot of sort of literature around actually the terminology that we use to describe climate change. Throughout this webinar, I'm going to use that term, climate change, but some have described it as the climate emergency, the climate crisis. So, you know, actually, there's a whole kind of terminology around this to describe what climate change is. I do think, though, that we can teach climate change in quite a linear way. And actually, climate change is only one quite small part of the jigsaw. And actually, this website called Planetary Health Check, I find really helpful. I find it helpful for two ways. I think, first of all, it really highlights kind of what's happening to the planet as a whole. So I think that's the first thing. But also, it really highlights, though, that sort of interdisciplinary and synoptic nature of geographers. So what this website does, it's a tool, and you can see there's sort of a radar diagram here. And actually, if you go into the tool, you can look at what the planetary health looked like in previous decades. So you can actually trace it over time. We have here different kind of domains, I suppose. And what the website and the tool tries to do is to describe how healthy those different domains are. So you can see that actually climate, we're operating, that's got a red sort of boundary, we're operating outside the Earth's safe sort of space. And you can see here the boundary is being transgressed. There's a sort of high risk of that. And I think that's really important because it really highlights that actually there are natural processes going on. I think when we sort of talk to our students about climate change, it can be quite tempting to sort of, you know, just think about the human aspect of climate change, when of course there are natural processes at work too. And what this website does is it acknowledges that. It says, look, you know, the climate is a thing. It changes naturally, but actually, what impact are humans having, and to what extent is climate operating outside that sort of safe, natural operating space? But it links the things together as well. So then it sort of talks about, okay, biosphere. We can see actually there are issues with the biosphere as well. That is acting outside the Earth's safe operating space, and that's high risk of doing so. And as geographers, we can see the links. We can see, okay, there are tipping points, there are positive feedback loops, and we can see the links between that. And so I think it's quite useful to actually not teach climate change in that sort of linear, almost one-dimensional way, but actually to go, look, it's part of this planetary health jigsaw. And I'm going to talk a little bit later on about geographies of hope, but I think there are geographies of hope in this diagram too. If we think about sort of the ozone layer, that was a huge issue in the sort of 1980s, but actually what humans have managed to do is to sort of grab that back, and actually now it is operating within that sort of safe space. So I think this is a useful tool for sort of explaining about why geographers should teach about climate change. I think, you know, it's very, very easy to say actually there's an argument for teaching about it generally, but I think as geographers, we can see those synoptic links and we can make those linkages between the different aspects of the planetary health. So I suppose the next question that sort of, you know, follows from that as well, sort of why should we teach it from a sort of subject perspective, because it's one of the biggest global challenges of the day, but also why should we teach it because actually it gives students skills that they will need for their futures. And on the graph, on the screen here, you can see a sort of a whole range of different bits of data that I've just sort of gathered together and put on the screen. You can see here, so the top graph looks at, this is from the Future of Jobs report from the World Economic Forum, and they sort of have looked at what the future of jobs is likely to be, looking at jobs being created and jobs being displaced. And I've highlighted here the sort of the issue, which is increased efforts and investments to adapt to climate change, what the likely impact that is going to have on jobs. And you can see that, yes, some people will have their jobs displaced as a result of climate change, but there will be many, many more jobs created, around sort of 5.5 million, they sort of are projecting. And then the sort of bar at the bottom, in the middle, shows different sort of sectors, different careers, which are going to sort of need to sort of develop in terms and adapt to climate change or to reduce carbon emissions. And I haven't put, it's quite an unwieldy graphic, so I haven't put the different careers there, but you can see that most careers, most sectors, over half of people think that actually, yes, we are going to have to adapt to climate change. We're going to have to reduce our carbon emissions. I think the two notable ones, which are quite interesting, are this one here, which is 16%, and this one here, which is 19%. I'm just going to pause for 5 seconds to give you a little bit of a chance to think about what those careers, what those sectors might be. The 19% is real estate, and the 16% is education. So I thought that was quite interesting, that actually we are educating our students to live in a world where their jobs may depend on adaptations to climate change and, you know, reducing carbon emissions. But as a sector, as an education sector, actually, we don't think that there is much that we need to do in terms of reducing carbon emissions. Just thought that was quite interesting. Also, the two quotes at the bottom. So in the UK, some of you might be aware, we are having a curriculum review at the moment, which means that the government is sort of saying what should be taught in the curriculum and why. And my personal view, and it's something that I actually sort of did my research about, is that actually teachers are there to teach the curriculum, but we don't want to do the curriculum to students, and we want to give them a bit of a voice in terms of what they want to find out and learn about. So in the UK, a group of students have sort of come together to produce a report which they've given to the government to say, this is what young people want to learn about as part of their curriculum. And these are just two quotes. There's a very, very substantial section in that report about sort of nature-based learning and about climate change. But these are two sort of quotes from that report. Key stage 3 pupils are sort of lower secondary, so sort of age between 11 and 14, and key stage 2 are upper primary, so they're sort of between about sort of 8 and 11. But they both, regardless of the age, they were sort of saying, actually, the things that affect my future are missing from my learning. For example, climate change. And the primary pupil, I think we could get more involved in the environment and what's happening with climate change. They really want to know about climate change and find out a little bit more about it, because they recognise that it's going to affect their future, both in terms of jobs, as we can see from the sort of diagrams there and the graphs there, but also because they genuinely are interested. So what do they already know? Every year, the Department for Education in the UK releases a report, and it's done in conjunction with the Royal Meteorological Society. And they ask people who are leaving school, so people who are sort of age 16, all about climate change. It's a really interesting report. But it's also a little bit depressing because the pupils want to know, we've seen on the previous slide, they really want to know and understand about climate change. But the way that they are being taught, or the content that they are being taught, means that they don't really have that knowledge and understanding. And the graph on the left shows here that actually this was one of the questions that was asked. How much do you think the climate of the Earth has warmed since 1850? The correct value is 1.1 degrees. And you can see there the whole range of answers. Only 5% got that range right. And you can see, nearly a third were saying, I just don't know the answer to that. So I think that's quite interesting in itself, to just say, actually, what do my pupils know about climate change? And actually, even if you've taught them, or you think you've taught them that information, how does it link up in their heads, in their brains? And are they able to kind of apply that knowledge to other scenarios and other questions? And then the information, the sort of graphic on the right, this is from an article, which is an open access article called What Children Know and Want to Know About Climate Change. And it's quite interesting because when they're asked what they want to know about climate change, I suppose it sounds a little bit obvious, but they think about what they already know, and they basically say, I'd like to know more about that. Which is fine, because actually what they're sort of saying, is I want to know more, and I want to have that deeper knowledge about the thing that I already know. But actually, I suppose as educators, what's really important is that we expand what they know as well. So it's about expanding that sort of width and breadth of their knowledge, whilst also going, oh, and you know about this already, let's dig deeper into that. So I think there's kind of two aspects to it. It's recognizing that people probably already know some things. They might have misconceptions about some things, but it's also about tapping into what they're interested in, and also thinking about how that then shapes the questions that they ask, and what they might want to know more about, and how we can kind of broaden those thoughts and ideas as well. So we've thought about why we should teach it. I think there's a really compelling case there. We've thought about what pupils already know. I think the next thing is actually quite tricky, and it's about the rise of eco-anxiety, because this is a difficult. The reason why geographers are teaching about it is because it is a global challenge, and as a consequence, there has been quite a significant rise in eco-anxiety, with pupils feeling quite, I suppose, disempowered, and something that they really can't deal with. It's very difficult for them, and it can cause sort of mental health issues as well. This is from the same report around school leavers, asking school leavers how they felt about climate change. And you can see that actually some school leavers are fairly unconcerned, not at all concerned about climate change. But actually, if you look at those that are concerned and not concerned, it's sort of about, a 53-35 split. So over half of these school leavers actually were concerned in some way about climate change. And I've put a link there to an article in the British Medical Journal about climate crisis and the rise of eco-anxiety. Just in case, you want to sort of have a look at this further. And then this quote here was from, again, from the youth report from a Key Stage 4 student. So this is sort of upper secondary, 15, 16-year-olds. I often lead discussions in our school environment club with the younger kids. I've seen my own fear and anxiety about the climate crisis mirrored in every one of them. And it breaks my heart to know that they too stay up at night because they're so scared about the future. So I think, as educators, it's that really difficult balance, isn't it? We have to recognise that there is a climate crisis, there is a climate emergency, and that can be quite difficult. We have to understand that actually teenagers might find that really, and us, might find that really difficult to cope with, because it's, when you think about sort of crisis, that as a word, I mean, we've just been through a global pandemic. That was very real. That was very sort of in your face. It was very kind of fast moving. It's much easier to see that as a crisis, whereas actually, for some, the impacts of the climate crisis, it might not affect them on a day-to-day basis. So it's that kind of time, I suppose, difference in time, and that sort of energy and emergency. It can be really difficult for pupils and for teachers to be able to deal with it. As a kind of sort of segue as well, I think one of my colleagues, Kit, has written on climate change as actually being a safeguarding issue. And it really is important for teachers to understand that, because actually, you know, safeguarding is a really important issue of education. And climate change can be a safeguarding issue. And it's a way to sort of start to speak about climate change in schools. So, for example, you know, there's some the links here in the table. It's really important that educators provide that safe environment in which children can learn. So thinking about, you know, exploring questions of positivity, empowerment. I'm going to be talking about geographies of hope in a second. But how do we talk about that in our classrooms? Are we just, I think as geographers, we're quite good at doing the, this is the cause, here are the impacts, that's it. And we don't give space for the, here are the causes, here are the impacts. Let's think about the mitigations and the adaptations to climate change. And actually providing that hopeful geography, that hopeful positivity and empowerment. And I think one thing that the new sort of syllabus does is it provides that sort of linkage around. It doesn't just stop at the, this is the problem and here are the impacts, which I think has been an issue in the past. You can look there at sort of online safety. I mean, I'm going to give you some links a bit later on to sort of look at ideas of ideas of climate change. Obviously, there's quite a lot on social media, different opinions, and how actually can we help students to sort of navigate that in a safe space. I think there's lots of things and questions to explore here. Again, that's probably a separate, different webinar. But you know, actually, this example here. So Sheffield is quite a large city in the UK. The students, for this teacher, they were caught in quite a lot of flooding. Many of the students were living in uninsured homes. They were at massive risk of homelessness. And actually, the incidence of flooding in that particular area has increased as a result of climate change. And there is that sort of discussion, actually, you know, our climate change is impacting our students directly. And it's about how do you have those conversations around things that are happening, because it's not always in other places, in other distant places. Sometimes it's actually happening to them. So I did say I would sort of be a bit more hopeful because it can be quite difficult to have those conversations. And so I've been quite, I suppose, I really do think it's important to teach this geography of hope. And if you're interested, there's a link to an article by David Alcock, who talks around this geography of hope and gives some sort of teaching strategies. But it's about recognizing that, yes, you know, there is a climate emergency. We're not going to sort of sweep that under the table. We're not going to not talk about it, because there is a climate emergency. Climate change is happening. Here is the science. Here is, you know, the geography around that. The world is awful. But we also have to say that, you know, the world is much better. And the world can be much better. And I think by focusing on mitigation and adaptation strategies, we can show how amazing people are at creating a world and you know, helping the world to become significantly better. So he gives in this particular example, he gives the idea of the example of sort of child mortality, infant mortality. And, you know, the world is awful. Globally, 4.3% of all children die before they're 15 years old. That's 5 million children dying every year. We're not going to suddenly say, oh, no, that's not a problem. The world is awful. But actually, let's look at the past. Like I did right at the beginning of the webinar, let's look back. What happened in the past? Well, in the past, around 50% of all children died. So today it's 4.3. So the world is much better. And actually, the world can be much better because globally, that's 4.3%. But actually, if we look at particular pockets of the world, for example, the European Union, that figure's 0.45% of all children. So it is about providing this geography of hope. And I've tried to kind of do a similar thing on the right-hand side for climate change. So the world is awful. Global temperatures are rising at alarming rates. 2024 is expected to exceed the 1.5 degree threshold above pre-industrial levels for the first time. January 2025 was recorded as the warmest January globally, with temperatures 1.75 degrees above pre-industrial levels, highlighting the intensifying climate change. The world is awful. But the world is much better because significant progress has been made in reducing emissions in some regions. And just to give you sort of the UK example, it's reduced its territorial emissions by over half. And reduced renewable energy adoption is accelerating globally, particularly in major emitters like China and India. So the world is much better. And the world can be much better because actually achieving a sustainable future is possible with stronger climate action. And if global emissions are reduced by 43% by 2030, that's the Paris Agreement, we could limit warming to 1.5 degrees C. So there needs to be that sort of increased adoption of renewable energy and stricter policies. But actually, further progress is achievable. And so for me, it's really important to present that geography of hope, to say, yes, you know, it is awful, but it is much better and it can be much better. And I think David Alcock in his article talks about sort of 3 ways of doing that. First of all, it's to understand what progress means. It's to evaluate progress and to understand, you know, actually positive trends. I think it's very easy for us to sort of look at that sort of difficult crisis data, but put that in the context of gains in other areas or you know, what progress looks like and what progress means. I think it's also about believing in humanity, you know, that potential of human nature to work collectively for the common good, whether that's sort of locally, nationally, or actually in sort of global governance, and really championing that futures thinking and education for sustainable development, which is hopefully why you're here and what I think actually as geography educators we can do. So I just want to spend a couple of minutes now just thinking about just a couple of tools and things that might help you. And then I'm going to sort of just mention some work I've been doing on green skills. So this is a really helpful tool, another really helpful tool from the Royal Meteorological Society. And I think one of the things, as I sort of alluded to earlier, is that we can think about climate change in isolation. We can think about it as a kind of one piece of the jigsaw, but that's not giving us the whole picture. And one of the things I feel quite strongly about is that, yes, climate change should be sort of taught as a discrete unit within the curriculum, but there are so many opportunities to link it to other things as well. And by that, if you do that, you can create this sort of rich narrative around sort of climate change and sustainability that runs as a thread throughout your geography curriculum. And the Royal Meteorological Society have created this tool where you can go in and you can look at different concepts, look at different geographical concepts and see how they link to issues of sustainability and climate change. Each concept is represented by a little blob. So you can click on the different blobs and it'll show you how. So the ones closest to the Earth, the pink ones, are the ones with the strongest connection between sort of sustainability and climate change. And then the ones around the outside, there are some links, but they're not as strong. So you can actually see, it can create this kind of really complex concept map to actually look at the things that you're teaching in geography and to see how they're linked to climate change so that you can make those connections for your students or encourage them to actually use the tool to make those linkages themselves. It's going back to that idea of, you know, as geographers, we are synoptic thinkers. We see the interrelationships between things. And this is a tool that really helps to really pull out those links throughout sort of sustainability and climate change. And I just want to sort of talk very briefly about green skills, because certainly in the UK context, this is something that is, I think, coming through in quite a lot of the policy literature, but also something that I've been sort of grappling with a little bit, because green skills is a terminology. And if we go back to sort of near the beginning when I was talking about jobs for the future, green jobs, we need to prepare our students for green jobs which have green skills. And don't get me wrong, I think that's really important. And my feeling is that with a really robust and thoughtful geographical education, which is also hopeful, we can do that. But as I started digging, I think one of the issues that I came up with was like, what are green skills? What are green jobs? Because actually, if you look in the literature, nobody actually has it will write down what these green skills are. There isn't a consensus. Some people just sort of say, actually, we're quite open by the fact we can't write these green skills down. And actually, people who do write them down, my sort of response was, well, aren't those just skills? What makes them green? So I did a bit of thinking, and actually, to my mind, I've come up with quite a nice solution to this, because actually, green skills are just skills until they're applied to a place and an issue. And that's what geographers do. So you can see this diagram here. We have that knowledge and understanding of people-environment interactions. We have that interconnected knowledge of the issues facing the planet that we saw in the planetary health chair. We look at place, we look at the impacts of climate change on place. We look at the impacts of biodiversity loss on place. And we also teach that hopeful future, thinking about mitigation and adaptation. And what green skills does is it takes all of those things that we also teach, like problem solving, communications, critical thinking, all of those things on the right-hand side, and it makes them green because it applies those to specific geographical issues and decision-making exercises. So I think that geographers are absolutely best placed to teach green skills and to because actually we do a lot of this work anyway, and it's the application of that to the knowledge and skills that we're giving pupils in a place-specific way that actually really makes these skills and makes the knowledge and understanding green. So I'm still doing a lot of thinking around that, but actually I feel really quite strongly that geography should own green skills because we are in the best place to teach them, and that's actually going to help students with the green jobs that apply these skills in the future. So I've talked quite a lot about sort of various ideas and things like that. I just want to talk a little bit about, okay, what sort of curriculum can do this? And I've been working on the new Collins book. And I think, actually having worked on it, that it does these things incredibly well. So it teaches around what climate change is and the sort of science around it. But then it talks about, okay, so what are the impacts? But how can we govern it? And then how can we mitigate and how can we adapt? And that for me is a really positive thing. It really closes that loop and helps to create that sort of hopeful geography of climate change and sustainability. The other thing that I think is really helpful is it does look at specific examples and tries to offer that sort of critical lens of what particular places and countries are doing. So you can see here an extract from the book looking at climate change management strategies in India. And one of the things that we've really tried to do is to sort of say, okay, well, why are we using this as an example? Why don't we pick somewhere else? And so looking at India as an example of sort of the climate change management strategies that is put in place, because actually what they're trying to do there is to balance economic growth and environmental sustainability. So this example really talks through how they try to do that. And it sets the context. It doesn't kind of just drop you into the example. It sort of says, okay, as I've been trying to do with this webinar, let's take a step back. What was geography like before? What's India's context? And then look at, okay, why has it chosen the strategies it's chosen? And let's evaluate those. Have they been any good? What's kind of going on here? So I think we need to teach climate change and sustainability critically. We need to teach it in an interconnected way. We need to teach it in a hopeful way. And for my, in my opinion, I think that the syllabus, the Cambridge International syllabus, and this book attempts to do that in a really effective and neat way. And I was just sort of saying to Amber, I've just been writing the teaching resources for this particular topic this morning. And actually what I've done is gone, actually, we need to build that sort of hopeful geography within it. So, it's looking at the planetary health check, it's looking at hopeful geographies and trying to encourage students to think in that sort of that hopeful way. So to summarize very quickly, what does that mean for geography teachers? What sort of are the sort of key takeaways, the key messages that I'd like to leave you with? I think, first of all, it's about embedding climate change, sustainability and green skills throughout your teaching. It's not a bolt-on. We do want to teach it as a discrete unit, but it's about signposting it throughout your curriculum, and the concept map that the Royal Meteorological Society have created is really helpful to do that. I think it's about building on what pupils already know. So taking their interests and sort of building that, but recognizing the limitations of that. And we want to kind of expand and create a breadth there as well. I think it's about illustrating the importance of climate change for future careers and saying, actually, there will be many jobs that are created as a result of this, and to say that geographers are in a really great place to have those jobs because of the way that we think. And it's that interrelated nature of the way that we think that really makes geographers so valuable, because we can see the different domains and how they relate to each other in terms of our planet's health. I think it's about drawing on geographies of hope and about saying, actually, the world can be better without being overly optimistic. We do need to kind of reiterate that there is a climate emergency, but actually thinking about, things like the Earthshot Prize, for example, which recognises and values people who have been really creative and innovative in trying to adapt and mitigate the issues of climate change, I think is a really helpful thing to draw pupils to. Recognise that climate change is a source of eco-anxiety and a potential safeguarding issue, and have those conversations with students as appropriate. And then I think that one of the things that we can do is to build those sort of issue evaluation and decision-making exercises into the curriculum, because that will help build people's green skills and help them think about climate change, sustainability and green skills within that sort of geographical issues-based curriculum. So thanks ever so much. I'm going to just leave you with this slide, and I know that Amber's been collecting questions as we've been going. So I will just take a swig of water and pass over to you, Amber.
Thank you so much, Becky. That was such an interesting webinar. If this has sparked any of your interest, one of our Collins reps will actually send you the samples of our geography resources that Becky has taken examples from throughout this presentation today. So do scan the QR code or click the link in the chat that my colleague is about to post now. So we'll move on to questions, but please do keep submitting them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We did have one in the chat which asked about where you said January was the hottest month, January 2025, on record, saying that temperatures in Gambia this January were really low compared to previous years. So is Gambia an anomaly? And also, they heard that Trump's inauguration temperatures were as low as -12 degrees. So was January the hottest month, or is this something?
Yes. So I think this is something that I find fascinating. I spend, well, probably more time than I should, looking at social media to see how people respond to particular things. So it's I think generally accepted, and obviously the data is quite new. So on average, globally, January 2025 was the warmest January on record. However, it's a global average. And so that means that some places will be warmer and some places will be colder. So yes, and also there is the issue about sort of weather versus climate. So we're looking for climate of those long-term trends. Weather is that day-to-day change. So there will be always examples. And I think this is where quite a lot of the misinformation on social media comes, because of course when that was released, you know, it's very, in a headline, January is the warmest January on record. It's very difficult then to go, and don't forget it's the global average, and don't forget we're talking about climate rather than weather, and don't forget that there will be examples where it's cold or warm because it's an average. So that's the sort of thing that you can definitely do with your students in class. You could unpick those kind of social media headlines and go, is it? How do we know? And then I think that's, and that for me is a really valuable thing to do, because it's getting students to engage critically with the data. Because yeah, it's all very well looking at the headlines, but actually we need to look at that from a geographer's perspective and go, right, is that headline true? What evidence do we have? And I've seen some really great lessons where people start with what they call a ridiculous statement. Climate change is not a thing, for example, and students have to disprove that ridiculous statement, which again is a great, because they love disproving teachers, don't they? So it's about framing it and getting them to think about those things critically. But yes, yeah, it was. But yeah.
Great, thank you. Another question is, should climate change be taught as a separate unit of work or embedded throughout the curriculum?
So I think, I mean, what the new Cambridge syllabus does, I think, quite well, and I think mirrors the sort of approach I would recommend, I think, is that it's done as a bit sort of the mechanisms and the processes are done as part of the atmospheric systems chapter. And then there's a separate chapter about climate change governance. So that talks about the sort of the projections for the future. It talks about the impacts, and then it talks about governance and strategies for mitigation and adaptation. So it's taught as kind of discrete bits of the curriculum, which I think is really important, because I think those are sort of almost place markers for climate change. If you don't have it as a discrete unit, actually it's very easy for it to get sidelined. But I also think that you have to keep, because climate change is part of that jigsaw, that sort of planetary health jigsaw, virtually every topic that you teach will have some aspect of climate change and sustainability where you can signpost and reference it. So that's kind of what I would suggest. I think it's really important that it's a discrete thing in the curriculum, but I also think that actually talking about the interrelationships, and that's what geographers do. That's the thing that makes our subject so special, and using it almost as an opportunity to do that, I think is the ideal.
Great. And how can teachers keep up to date with the changing science of climate change?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I suppose, a really difficult question, in that our subject is so dynamic and so contemporary, and you could argue it's kind of changing on a daily basis. I mean, you know, we've just had the question about, you know, January temperatures. I think there are some really great resources out there. So I've already mentioned a couple of times the Royal Meteorological Society. I think they've got some really good stuff on climate change. The Planetary Health Check, you can go back and sort of have a look, and that's up to date, and they do a report each year. So talking about planetary health, which I think is useful. But I've also found some quite accessible websites which have got resources on. So the MIT Climate Portal is great. It's got sort of explainers, so you can take things from, you know, I suppose about A-level standards. A-level students would understand it, for example. But it's also got podcasts, and it takes the science and tries to put it in an accessible way. So I think that's really useful. If you want to go directly to, you know, the UN and the IPCC websites, the UN's got climate change portal. And again, that's actually relatively accessible. There's quite a lot of stuff there, quite a lot of, but certainly around governance, that's quite a good place to go, about how we're, you know, globally sorting the problem and governing the importance of climate change, I think is yeah. So that's quite a good resource. And then I find, I mean, the Guardian, which is a newspaper in the UK, they've got a website and they collate and curate articles to do with climate change in like almost like a pin board, which they update really regularly. So again, that's quite a good place to go because it's got articles that again contextualize things in a quite an accessible way. So those would be sort of my go-to, I think. I think it's you want to find something that's accessible for you and your students. You don't want to find something that's overly scientific or overly kind of technical speak, but something that your students can engage with and you can kind of help them to unpick and navigate.